Hello YouTube. Okay, I want to look at philosophy of mind, and I'm going to go through the main theories. We're going to start with substance dualism. This is, I suppose, the naive theory of the mind. Most lay people are probably substance dualists. Certainly substance dualism is presupposed by most major religions. It's pretty much universally rejected in philosophy. There are hardly any philosophers of mind these days who are substance dualists. But it was historically important, so we have to look at it. The most famous proponent of substance dualism was René Descartes, this guy. He had his own particular version of it, known as Cartesian dualism, which I'll sketch out in this video. The basic idea is simple. Descartes saw the world as being divided into two distinct and fundamental substances, matter and mind. That's the basic claim of substance dualism. So, there seem to be very fundamental, irreconcilable differences between our mental states and the material objects in the external world. First, it seems that material objects have a clear size and shape. Just look around you. The same cannot be said for mental states. What's the size or shape of a desire to eat chocolate cake, or desire to travel to Iceland, or the belief that your car is parked outside? It seems nonsensical to suggest that these could have any size or shape. So the mental appears to be entirely non-spatial. Second, mental states appear to have many properties that material objects lack. Suppose you're looking at a red car. Well, as long as your vision is functioning normally, this will cause you to experience the image of a particular colour, red. But now suppose I surgically open up your brain as you're doing this. I won't see any red in there. Or suppose you're feeling happy. Could we ever observe happiness in a material object? Again, even if we opened up your skull and looked at your brain, it seems absurd to suggest that we could literally see the happiness in there, or rather terror if your skull's been opened. Now granted, people can express happiness by, say, smiling, but that's just behaviour, that's not the mental state itself. Just compare your feeling happiness with seeing someone else express happiness. There's an obvious difference. So there seems then to be a significant distinction between the mental and the material, and this kind of consideration leads many people to feel that the mental and the material must be fundamentally different kinds of substance. Well, Descartes, for one, agreed with that. He held further that each of these substances has a basic or essential property, which makes each substance what it is. So consider a valley. A valley has many properties. It might have a certain number of trees in it, has a certain height, a certain width, and so on. Now the number of trees it contains could be removed, and it would still be a valley. We could change its width by making it a few meters wider. It would still be a valley. So some of its properties are non-essential or accidental properties of the valley. But now consider, could you remove the hills either side of it? Well, sure, we could do, but then it wouldn't be a valley anymore. You can't take the hills away without taking the valley away. So an essential property of a valley is that it has hills or mountains or whatever either side of it. That's part of the essence of a valley. So we can distinguish accidental properties of a thing, such as the number of trees in a valley, and the essential properties of a thing, such as the structures either side of a valley. According to Descartes, the essential property of matter is extension, or spatiality. All kinds of matter have extension in space. Obviously there are many different ways of being extended. Descartes calls these modes of extension, and the different modes of extension are what give each material object its different properties. The shape of a leaf, the liquidity of water, the particular soft texture of cotton, and so on. These are different modes of extension. What about mind? Well, the essential property of mind is thought, and all different mental states are different modes of thought. So, to sum that up then, a pen, a glass, a rock, an insect, your hand, all these have in common that they're made of the substance matter, which possesses the basic property of extension. The different properties of pens, glasses, rocks, and so on are due to their different modes of extension. Similarly, a belief, a desire, pain, a dream, a perception, all these have in common that they are made of the substance mind, which has the basic property of thought. Their different properties arise from there being different modes of thought. And finally, despite the differences between mind and matter, they do interact in ways we're all familiar. Our minds control our bodies. Though our bodies are material, they have a mind somehow attached to them or interacting with them and controlling with them. And the body, through the sense organs, causes experiences in the mind. Well, that's the picture offered by Descartes. What's important about this picture is not so much the modes and properties and so on, but the basic idea that mind and matter are fundamentally distinct substances. This is the view that all substance dualists share, whether or not they accept the details of the Cartesian theory. As I mentioned, this is a fairly intuitive, commonsensical sort of view, so it's certainly worth considering. So let's look at some of the arguments. Well, Descartes offered a few arguments for substance dualism. Let's consider the argument from doubt. Descartes famously observed that he could doubt the existence of any material object. If you imagine an evil, extremely powerful demon is controlling your thoughts, manufacturing your experiences, then even the objects you see and feel around you could be hallucinations created by the demon. Or maybe you're a brain in a vat, or maybe you're dreaming right now. Whatever, there are many ways to doubt the existence of the immediate material world. However, you cannot doubt that you're thinking. Doubting is a kind of thinking, so if you're doubting anything, you must be thinking. The suggestion that you could doubt the existence of your own mind is simply incoherent. So, I can doubt that my body exists, but I cannot doubt that my mind exists. Now, there's a famous principle about identity which Descartes draws on, known as the indiscernibility of identicals, or Leibniz's law. That's, if A is identical to B, then every property of A is a property of B, and vice versa. Bear in mind we're talking here about numerical identity, not qualitative identity. To see this distinction, take two twins, Frank and Bob. We might say that they're identical because they look the same, they have the same size, the same shape, and so on. However, they also have differences, because they occupy different spatial locations, for example. So Frank and Bob are merely qualitatively identical. They share all the relevant properties, but they're not the same thing. But now take, say, Lewis Carroll and Charles Dodgson. We say that Lewis Carroll and Charles Dodgson are numerically identical in that it's the same person. A and B are numerically identical if A and B are one and the same thing. So Leibniz's law says that if A and B are one and the same thing, then every property of A is a property of B, and vice versa. And that is surely true. If A and B are different in some way, they can't be one and the same thing. These considerations lead to a neat little argument that the mind cannot be one and the same thing as any part of the body. So here it is. I can doubt that my body and any of its parts exist. I cannot doubt that my mind exists. Therefore, my mind is not identical with my body or any part of it. So, all parts of the body, in fact, all parts of the material world in general, have the property of being dubitable by me. I can doubt their existence. But the mind is not dubitable by me. So they cannot be identical, because there is at least one property they do not share. Mind and body must be distinct. One is dubitable by me, one isn't. They don't share all their properties, so they can't be the same thing. Well, this is a neat little argument, but I'm afraid it's straightforwardly fallacious. The first thing to note, of course, is that dubitability is not an intrinsic property of anything. Rather, it's not a property that things have in themselves. Rather, it's a relation between thinkers and things. And the important thing to realise is that Leibniz's law fails in opaque contexts. What does this mean? What's an opaque context? Well, consider this argument. I can doubt that Don Van Vliet wrote Trout Mask Replica. I cannot doubt that Captain Beefheart wrote Trout Mask Replica. Therefore, Don Van Vliet is not identical with Captain Beefheart. However, Don Van Vliet is Captain Beefheart. They are identical. Captain Beefheart is the stage name of Don Van Vliet. The problem with the argument is that the sentences in its premises concern my mental states, and I may be unaware that Don Van Vliet and Captain Beefheart refer to the same person. If I'm unaware that Vliet is Beefheart, I can easily doubt that Vliet wrote Trout Mask Replica. Constructions such as I doubt that, I believe that, John hopes that, Sarah desires that, and so on. These constructions, which describe mental states, introduce what philosophers call opaque contexts. And in these contexts, we can no longer substitute expressions which refer to the same thing, because of course the person in question might not be aware that they refer to the same thing. If you compare, on the other hand, the straightforward claims Don Van Vliet did not write Trout Mask Replica and Captain Beefheart wrote Trout Mask Replica, where we're just describing objective states of affairs in the world, obviously we can substitute co-referring expressions, and we could say that if Don Van Vliet didn't write Trout Mask Replica and Captain Beefheart did, well obviously Don Van Vliet and Captain Beefheart are not the same person. But clearly when we're dealing with a person's mental states, we have to bear in mind that his knowledge may be incomplete, hence such substitutions may fail. So the argument from doubt is a straightforward fallacy. Closely related to the argument from doubt is Descartes' argument from imaginability. The goal of this argument is to unearth which properties are essential to your existence. Recall the distinction between accidental and essential properties. Descartes is here asking, what properties are essential to you? And to discover this, he has you imagine away everything that's not essential to you, everything you could conceivably exist without. Whatever you're left with must be that without which you can't exist. Now, just as you can doubt the existence of your body, you can easily imagine yourself without a body. Indeed, some people claim to have actually experienced this, because some people claim to have had out-of-body experiences. People who've died and then been resuscitated occasionally claim to have floated out of their bodies and looked down on their body as it was on the hospital bed and so on. So you can imagine yourself existing without your body. However, you cannot imagine away your thought. Imagination is a kind of thinking, so the idea of imagining yourself without thought is simply incoherent. So Descartes concludes that your thought is essential to you, whereas your body is not. Thought, of course, is a property of mind. You are essentially a mind. As with the argument from doubt, this is a fairly weak argument for at least two reasons. First, imaginability tells us little about possibility. We can all imagine time travelling into the past. Plenty of books and TV shows that involve it. We can think about it, we can work out its consequences. Nevertheless, time travelling into the past may be simply impossible. Similarly, it may be that having a material body, or at least part of a material body, such as the brain, is essential to my existence, even though I can imagine myself existing without one. Imagination tells us nothing about possibility. And second, Descartes is simply wrong. I can imagine myself not to be thinking. His argument seems to work only because he confines himself to the present tense. It's certainly true that at some moment I cannot imagine myself not to be thinking at that very moment. However, I can obviously imagine myself not to be thinking in the past or in the future. Compare, for example, the statement, I am dead. Nobody can truly assert this statement. Anybody who makes any kind of statement must be alive. But we can assert, in the future, I will be dead. So I can imagine myself having a body but not having any thoughts. I can imagine myself being in a dreamless sleep or in a coma. It's just it would be at some point in the past or future that I'm imagining that. Okay, the explanatory gap. This is probably the most powerful argument for dualism. I mentioned when I explained the basic dualist picture that there seem to be very fundamental differences between mental states and material objects. And the basic issue is here that it seems impossible to explain how material phenomena, dendrites, axons, glial cells, electrical and chemical processes in their head, could give rise to their mental phenomena we all experience. How could some collection of neurons in the head be a desire or be the feeling of pain? So there is an explanatory gap. There's a gulf between the material and the mental. Let's consider some aspects of the mental that we might think are beyond materialist explanation. First, there's the fact that our minds exhibit rationality, language, and the ability to engage in mathematical reasoning. These facts were particularly impressive to Descartes. What's notable about reason and language is not just that it seems difficult to understand how physical matter could produce them, but that they seem to positively transcend the limitations of physical matter. Consider the fact that we can all understand a potentially infinite number of sentences. Granted there are limits on the length of sentences that we can understand, but these limits don't seem to be intrinsic to our language or rationality itself. Rather, we would stop reading a sentence because of, say, boredom or whatever. But we can, in principle, just sort of go on forever. We can understand a potentially infinite or indefinite number of sentences. Also consider how our concepts and ideas go far beyond anything in the material world. We can think about things that don't even exist. So there seems to be a sense in which language and reasoning and so on transcend physical limitations. The brain itself is finite, but these things seem to go beyond what the physical world could achieve. Second, many of our mental states exhibit intentionality. Now, we must distinguish this from the colloquial everyday sense of intentionality. Intentional, per the common definition, is used to denote actions that are done on purpose, that are deliberate. Thus, there's an important difference between intentionally kicking the dog and just kicking the dog, perhaps by accident. This is not what intentional means when it's used by philosophers of mind. In philosophy, intentionality means directedness or aboutness. A mental state has intentionality when it is about something else. So the belief that snow is white is about snow. The desire to eat chocolate ice cream is about chocolate ice cream. A young child's fear of the monster under his bed is about the monster under his bed. Now, there are many puzzling questions about intentionality, but the basic problem here is how exactly could mere arrangements of matter be about things? The belief that snow is white is about snow, but that involves some kind of relation between the belief and the snow, and what exactly is the nature of that relation? What is it that connects the concept of snow with snow? Further, mental states can be about plenty of things, such as the monster under the bed, that don't even exist. Now, this is all completely unlike anything we observe in the world of physical phenomena. Mountains, trees, oceans, pavements, cars, and so on aren't about things. How could the waves and particles of physics give rise to something like this? Finally, all our mental states have a certain phenomenological feel. What do I mean by this? Basically, there's something it's like to be in a particular mental state, to have a certain mental state. There's something it's like, for example, to see red or to be in pain. Seeing a patch of red has a different character, a different phenomenal character than seeing a patch of green. When I was a kid, I remember thinking to myself, what if the way I see red is the way you see green? Now here I was imagining that the phenomenal character of my seeing red was different to the phenomenal character of your seeing red. The technical term for these ways that things seem to us, for the phenomenal character of our mental states, is qualia. That's the plural. Singular is quail. In my thought experiment, I was imagining that we were subject to different qualia on seeing red, that your qualia for red were like my qualia for green. Now, this last point is the one that I think poses the biggest intuitive problem to materialist accounts. Indeed, the question of how to account for qualia, for the phenomenal character of mental states, is known as the hard problem of consciousness, so named by David Chalmers. Chalmers identifies a whole bunch of what he calls easy problems. Now, these problems are not really easy, in fact they're quite difficult, but with these problems it's conceivable how a materialist explanation might work. So these include how we can focus our attention, how we can control our behaviour, the difference between wakefulness and sleep, our ability to access our own internal states and to report them to others, and so on. As Chalmers notes, There is no real issue about whether these phenomena can be explained scientifically. To explain access and reportability, for example, we need only specify the mechanism by which information about internal states is retrieved and made available for verbal report. For an account of sleep and wakefulness, an appropriate neurophysiological account of the processes responsible for the organism's contrasting behaviour in those states will suffice. The Chalmers goes on to argue that with qualia, what it's like to be in a certain state, are in another class entirely. There seems to be no reason why physical processes should give rise to such a rich variety of experience. Why is there something it's like to see red, to be in pain, to desire chocolate ice cream? It's important to realise, with things like intentionality and qualia, it's not simply that no explanation is being provided, it's that no explanation is even conceivable. Just think of something you don't understand. Maybe, for example, you don't understand why it is that skin goes wrinkly in water. Nevertheless, you can easily imagine a plausible explanation for this. Whether or not the explanation is true, you can imagine one that makes sense. In fact, you can imagine many that make sense. Here's one. Maybe water gets absorbed into the skin, causing the skin to expand, and then obviously the skin wrinkles up to accommodate the greater amount of space it takes up. That's a plausible explanation. And then, of course, the absorption of water into the skin could be explained by appealing to the physical properties of water and the biological makeup of the skin. So this account, if true, could give us a good answer to the question. But for the question, how could mental states arise from unthinking, unfeeling bits of matter, seems nobody has a clue. Now, with all that said, this is perhaps not such a big deal. In the 18th century, there was a great debate between materialism and vitalism. The vitalists just couldn't see, given its intricacy and self-sustainability, how life could be nothing more than mere arrangements of matter. They suggested that living organisms were fundamentally different to non-living entities, that living organisms contained some kind of non-physical element, a non-physical vital force. Now, of course, these days we understand perfectly well how particular arrangements of matter constitute life. And looking back in retrospect, it's difficult to see why people had any trouble with it. Modern developments in the biological sciences have totally transformed the worldview of our society, so that now we have no problem with this kind of thing. Well, coming back to the mind, we've seen that Descartes just couldn't imagine how any merely material physical system would be able to engage in reasoning or mathematical thinking or use complex language. And considering the resources that were available to him in his day, that's an understandable conclusion. But recent technological developments have shed new light here. We now have purely mechanical calculators that appear to far outstrip any human's grasp of mathematics. We have chess-playing programs that are capable of beating grandmasters. I'm sure you've seen those online artificial intelligence programs like Cleverbot that can simulate human conversations. Obviously they can't do it very well, but this does suggest that the claim that physical systems can't use language is premature. So it's now easier to see how these parts of the mind, which were once totally mysterious, might be amenable to materialist explanation. They might be, and who knows what the future holds. Still, we can identify at least two big problems for any materialist account of the mind. That's intentionality and qualia. A great deal of modern work in philosophy of mind focuses on trying to resolve these two problems. Intentionality and qualia, they're the two big problems. And it's certainly true that there does appear to be an explanatory gap there. It is very mysterious indeed how materialists might be able to account for those two things. Finally, a dualist may appeal to parapsychological phenomena, things such as telepathy, telekinesis, psychic ESP, precognition. All of these are mental phenomena, and none of them appear to be accommodated within mainstream science, so perhaps they suggest that there might be more to the mind than purely physical matter. Really, this is just another appeal to the explanatory gap, but anyway, this argument is not compelling for two primary reasons. First of all, the fact is that there is simply no reliable, uncontroversial evidence whatsoever for any parapsychological phenomena. There are suggestions, there are hints, but researchers have been studying this stuff for many decades now, There's just no clear evidence for any of this kind of stuff. But secondly, more interestingly, let's pretend that we did have good evidence for parapsychological phenomena. Well, it's not at all clear that such phenomena would support dualism, because there may be an entirely materialist explanation for them. For example, in his introduction to philosophy of mind, Paul Churchland suggests a materialist account of telepathy. Telepathy. Thinking is an electrical activity within the brain, but according to electromagnetic theory, such changing motions of electric charges must produce electromagnetic waves radiating at the speed of light in all directions, waves that will contain information about the electrical activity that produced them. Such waves can subsequently have effect on the electrical activity of other brains, that is, on their thinking. Now, this is almost certainly false. There's no good reason to believe that telepathy exists anyway, but it goes to show that paranormal phenomena do not necessarily support dualism, so I think we can dismiss this argument. Whatever the worth of arguments in its favour, substance dualism faces a host of objections. Let's consider some standard ones. First, there's a complete lack of any empirical evidence for this mental substance. When we look inside people's heads, we find physical stuff. There doesn't appear to be anything else in there. Now, perhaps the dualist could respond that we have no empirical evidence, because empirical evidence can only be acquired by material means. All our experimental equipment is made of matter, but the mind is mental, fundamentally different in kind from material substances. So there's no reason to suppose that we could discover it, literally observe it. Perhaps there's simply no way for material experimental equipment to detect a mental substance. I'm not sure whether this response works though, because dualists almost always hold that mind and matter can interact, and if they can interact, there should be some way for us to detect the mind, surely. This point, however, leads us to another problem for the dualist, the interaction problem. And this is probably the most famous objection to substance dualism. Pretty much everybody accepts that the mind and the body interact in one way or another. The mind causes the body to do things, the bodily sense organs cause experience in the mind. The question is, how is this possible given substance dualism? If mind and matter are fundamentally different kinds of substances, how do they interact with one another? The problem is compounded when we recall that mental substances are essentially non-spatial. How could something which has no extension affect a material object? That seems to defy our usual conception of cause and effect. The fact is, we simply have no good model for how mind and matter could interact, given substance dualism. Of course, whether this is an objection rather than a mere problem for the dualist to sort of solve. I mean, there are plenty of things that the materialist can't explain at the moment too. We've already seen two of them, intentionality and qualia. But is that to be taken as an objection, or is that merely something that the materialist needs to work on? So the interaction problem isn't decisive, but it certainly is a problem for dualism. Okay, neural dependence. Well, it's obvious that the mind is heavily dependent on the brain. Our ability to use language, our ability to reason, our emotions, our personalities, and so on, all clearly depend on our brains. If the functioning of our brain is impaired by drugs or illness or accident or whatever, our mental states can change very radically or even disappear. In fact, this is something we all experience every single night. When you go to sleep, for some of the time you dream, but for most of it you'll be completely unconscious. If your mind is a separate, non-physical substance, what's going on here? Why exactly does this happen? If the non-physical mind is a different thing to the physical brain, we would expect it to be relatively unaffected by changes to brain states. But that's not what we see. This point has received confirmation from the neurosciences. In fact, we actually know quite a lot about how different mental states and capacities depend on the proper functioning of the brain. Very briefly, we know how different drugs affect different brain states and how particular chemical changes in the brain are associated with different moods. We know that comprehension and use of language is associated with Broca's area and Wernicke's area, and damage to these areas is associated with very particular disorders. Motor skills and motor memory are associated with the basal ganglia and the cerebellum. Strong emotional responses, especially fear and the encoding of emotional memories, are associated with the amygdala. We even have some idea of how more abstract processes such as recognition of people and things take place in the brain. I'll link a video about that one in the description box. Now, I'm not here to give a lecture on neuroscience, of course, but the fact is that we have a pretty good understanding of the various parts of the brain and how they relate to our mental operations. And so the question is, what exactly is there left for a non-physical mind to do? If there is some sort of non-physical part to our body, it doesn't seem to play any role in our mental operations. All of our mental operations appear to be a result of our brain. They're all dependent on our brain. Now, a standard response to this problem was familiar to Descartes. He suggested imagining a very skilled violinist. The violinist will be severely limited in how he can display his skill. If you give him a broken violin, he won't be able to display his skill at violin playing. The expression of the skill requires that he has a reasonably good violin that's tuned properly and is generally working correctly. And the idea is that the mind and the brain relate in a similar way. The mind will not be able to realise its abilities if the brain is damaged. A more modern example that I've heard compares the mind and the brain to a radio. When you turn on a radio, it picks up transmissions and converts them into sound that we can hear. Now, if you smash the radio up, it will no longer function properly, and the sound we hear will be distorted, or maybe there won't be any sound at all. However, the transmissions are unaffected. Get another radio, you'll pick them up just fine. In this example, the dualist's mind substance is analogous to the transmissions, while the material brain is analogous to the radio. I think this response is fairly reasonable, though I do want to note in passing that for many dualists this may be conceding a bit too much. One of the things that's really appealing about substance dualism is that it allows the possibility that we could survive our physical deaths. Our brains will one day die and decompose. If we're to survive this, we must ultimately be non-physical, as the substance dualist holds. Now, the trouble with this kind of response to the neural dependence problem is that it doesn't actually deny that for us to exist, we need our brains. In fact, it seems to imply this. Consider the radio analogy. To get sound from the radio, you need both the transmissions and the physical radio. If there is no physical radio to pick up the transmissions, you won't get the sounds. On the violinist analogy, for the violinist to manifest his skill, you need both the violinist's skill and a properly functioning violin. It's entirely possible that our mental states require both non-physical stuff and physical brains, so that if either one doesn't exist, we don't exist. Few substance dualists would want to accept this, so they need to be careful responding to the neural dependence problem. Okay, evolutionary history. Humans, like all creatures on this planet, are the results of evolution. We emerged due to the entirely physical processes of natural selection, genetic drift, gene flow, and so on. So the question is, how does the dualist's non-physical mind fit into this? By what mechanism and for what reason did non-physical mental substances evolve? There just doesn't seem to be any way, given what we know about the development of humanity, for us to have been endowed with a non-physical mind. Right, the argument from Explanatory: impotence. Dualism has been around for a very long time, centuries, millennia, and in that time it's had very little development. Dualism just doesn't seem to be a very good explanation. It doesn't have many explanatory virtues. It's not parsimonious. It's not simple. It postulates a whole different part of reality, populated by entities unlike anything that we're familiar with. It does not make any novel testable predictions, and it hasn't produced any concrete research programs that do make novel testable predictions. As we've seen with evolution, it doesn't cohere very well with our overall worldview since the acceptance of modern evolutionary theory. Finally, and most importantly, it's It's arguable that dualism doesn't really explain the one thing it was designed to explain, namely the mind. What exactly is the mind substance on substance dualism? We don't know what it's made of, we don't know what kind of laws it's subject to, we don't know how it relates to and interacts with the body, we don't know what laws govern the interaction between mind and body, we're not given any account of how the mind actually gives rise to our mental capacities, and so on. Now, we noted earlier that one of the main arguments for substance dualism is the explanatory gap, but it's questionable in my opinion whether dualism actually solves the explanatory gap. The trouble is that substance dualism doesn't really offer much of an explanation for anything. Okay, we have the assertion that mind and matter are distinct, but that's it. To me, this doesn't say anything about how the mind really works. When we considered the explanatory gap argument for dualism, we saw a number of properties of mental states that seem impossible to explain given materialism. But how exactly does dualism explain any of these properties? How does positing a non-physical mind substance help us understand, help us explain intentionality and self-awareness and qualia and so on? To me at least, dualism doesn't make any of these problems any less mysterious. I think it's worth dwelling on this. The primary argument for dualism involves appealing to things that don't yet make much sense on a materialist worldview. We don't have much of a clue how certain mental properties are produced by processes going on in the brain, but it doesn't look like the dualist actually does any better in explaining these properties than the materialist does. So when you look at it this way, dualism seems less like a theoretical rival to materialism and more like a mere expression of incredulity. And until it offers a more positive, substantial account of the mind, that's how things are going to stay. So it seems that materialism beats dualism on every explanatory virtue. Considering again the failures of dualism that I noted, contrast this with materialism. Materialism is simpler. The mind is made of just the same stuff that everything else is. The neurosciences and cognitive sciences, which are based on materialist assumptions, make many testable predictions. Materialism coheres perfectly well with our overall worldview, and materialists, although they can't give a complete story, actually can explain a lot about the mind, and of course are making greater progress with every day that goes by. So, dualism appears to be explanatorily impotent. Right, finally, there's the problem of individuating minds. The substance dualist holds that there is one mind connected to one body. Each mind has one body, each body has one mind. But there's a problem here. What if I suggest that there are 2, 3, even an infinite number of non-physical substances attached to a particular body, all thinking the same thoughts? Now you probably think this suggestion is absurd. Maybe so. But how do we distinguish it from the more average dualist suggestion that there's only one mind per body? We need some way of distinguishing minds. We need a criterion of individuation by which we can distinguish a situation in which there is one mind from a situation in which there are many similar but not numerically identical minds. If you imagine material objects, just take our twins Frank and Bob again. We can imagine that Frank and Bob are very similar. In fact, let's suppose they're exactly alike. They share every single one of their intrinsic properties. They're exact duplicates. Nevertheless, we still have a very easy way of telling them apart. We have a criterion of individuation. They occupy different spatial locations. So if I'm talking to Bob, I might not be sure whether it's Frank or Bob that I'm talking to, but I know that it's not both Frank and Bob. Frank and Bob are numerically different, so they can't occupy the same space. We don't have anything like this for minds. Minds are non-spatial. There is no way, even in principle, to distinguish a situation in which we have one mind and in which we have 2 exactly alike minds or even an infinite number of exactly alike minds. But in that case, is the concept of a non-spatial mind even meaningful? It's at least questionable whether we even have a coherent concept here. So, those are some objections to substance dualism. They're certainly not the only objections we might raise to substance dualism, and obviously we didn't see all of the arguments in its favour either. But that's a bit of an introduction to the position. That's a bit of the lay of the land as far as dualism is concerned. As I mentioned at the start, substance dualism is pretty much universally rejected within philosophy of mind. It doesn't really get serious consideration from contemporary philosophers who hold instead that the mind is, in one way or another, a product of the material physical world. We'll explore all that in some later videos. But I would tend to agree with that materialist assumption. I hope that this hasn't been too biased an introduction. Believe me, there are textbooks on philosophy of mind that have been more biased than this, because it really is just not accepted by well, I mean, I suppose that there are some who accept it, but very, very few philosophers of mind accept substance dualism anymore. But we'll see some of the materialist ideas in some later videos. That's enough for today. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.